Welcome to the Listen Up podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the Listen Up podcast, where I feature top leaders in healthcare. This episode is brought to you by Listen Up Hearing Centers. We help patients to effectively treat their hearing loss so that they can remain better connected socially with friends and family and remain independent. The reason I'm so passionate about hearing loss is because I lost my brother Robbie twice, first to the hearing loss from radiation to his brain tumor, and then when he passed away. I am an ear, nose, and throat doctor who only takes care of E. I'm the E of ENT. I performed over 10,000 surgeries and care for thousands of patients with hearing loss. I'm the founder of Listen Up Hearing Center, and I've written a book with the same name, which is Listen Up, A Physician's Guide to Effectively Treating Your Hearing Loss. If you'd like to learn more, go to www.listenuphearing.com. Today, I'm excited to talk to our guest. It's Dr. Dr Chasin. He is an audiologist and the director of the Auditory Research at the Musicians Clinic of Canada. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, an associate professor at the Communications Disorders and Sciences School at Western University. He's written extensively, over 200 articles and 7 books, including Musicians and the Prevention of Hearing Loss. He currently writes a monthly column in the Hearing Review called Back to Basics and a weekly blog in the hearinghealthmatters.org. He also has a new book that we're coming out that we're going to talk about. Dr. Chasin has been the recipient of many awards over the past years, including the 2012 Queen Elizabeth II Silver Jubilee Award to Service to Canada. He's also received the Canada 150 Medal in 2017. And I don't know when he sleeps, but he's also developed an app called Temporary Hearing Loss Test App. So he's got a lot going on. He's really interesting. And I'm excited to have him here because he is an expert on musicians and hearing loss. Dr. Chasin, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Dr. Sims. I must admit to being both interested and interesting.
Well, that's great. So tell me a little bit about, you've got your expertise and your passion seemingly to me, is hearing loss as an associate and hearing as associates to musicians, right? So that's where you are now. How'd you get here? Like, what was your pathway to this particular area of interest?
Well, I come from a very nerdy background. Unlike most audiologists, my background was mathematics and physics, and I was en route to becoming a theoretical mathematician. Talk about boring. I could do it. It just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And I was very interested in communication systems, formal algebras. I know that is boring. So I took a master's of linguistics, which is human communication. And that really was boring, although it was very interesting. Don't get me wrong. I still teach in the faculty of linguistics, but finally my graduate advisor said, have you ever heard of audiology, which is human communication, or at least the breakdown of human communication? So it was a very natural trend for me. And after several years working in the field, I discovered working with musicians, or more importantly, musicians and the prevention of hearing loss. And I think that is very, very important.
Yeah. So about them, is there any particular musician or something that took you to this space?
There were a lot of musicians in the Hamilton Philharmonic. For those that don't know, if you look at the Great Lakes, at the Lake Ontario, the last Great Lake on the right, the most easterly one, at the very west end of it, there's a little town called Hamilton. They had a pretty good Philharmonic orchestra, but all of the musicians had physical injuries, wrist problems, arm problems, back problems, hearing problems, and a lot of it was maybe related to the management, shall we say. And so I became involved with some people who are physicians and other people in communication disorders. And we developed what's called the musiciansclinics.com, Musicians Clinics of Canada. It's a great website. So it's plural of the word musicians, plural of the word clinics, one word though, musiciansclinics.com. And it's a wealth of information there. And I've been working with them and the treatment of musicians and keeping them healthy, I think, is the bottom line. So what can we do today such that 25, 30 years from now, that musician can still enjoy and play their music if they want to?
So, what is your basic couple of things? Like if you were to give me, the 40,000 foot view, you're just like, hey, what are the couple of things people should be doing? Besides, I assume conservation, protection is a big part.
Well, most definitely. The interesting thing about humans is that we're wonderful creatures to tell frequency. We know whether something is sharp and flat. You don't need to be a musician for that. If somebody hits a sour note, you know it's sour. But we're not very good as a species for loudness. So I can say some things that are soft. I can say it loud and say, yeah, it's louder, but that's about all we can say. But it turns out that anything over 85 decibels, if you listen to it long enough, can ruin your hearing. And that's true of music as well as factory noise. The ear doesn't know the difference in all the wisdom. But 85 decibels is, to many people, is just a number. You can maybe measure it on your smartphone with a sound level meter app. But let me give you an example of 85 decibels. A dial tone on a telephone, for those of us that still have landlines. Anybody that would pick up a phone and hear the buzz of a dial tone or a busy signal, they would say, that's not that loud. It's not something I want to listen to every day, but it's not that loud. And that's the problem, is that a potentially damaging level of music or noise is not all that loud. It's actually quite soft. So a lot of it has to do with education and making people aware of what is potentially damage. Rock and roll, people kind of point to that with a finger and say, yeah, that's really, really damaging. Turns out, interestingly enough, that rock and roll is no more nor less damaging than beautiful classical Mozart or Beethoven. One of the reasons is that the sound levels are actually very similar. It's not all that loud, but it is enough to cause hearing loss if you listen to it long enough. There's another difference in that rock and rollers enjoy their music. And it turns out that if you enjoy your music or enjoy the noise exposure, it actually is slightly, not a lot, but slightly less damaging. That is, if we don't enjoy something, if we're stressed about something, we're nervous about something, then that will have a synergistic or greater effect on your hearing loss down the line. So it turns out that at the smallest molecular level, hearing loss from loud noise or loud music is the very, very, very same thing as any other stress system in our body. I know in the 60s, I'm old enough to remember the headlines of the 60s, stress was the big killer, but they would be talking about the kidneys and the heart and why you shouldn't be stressed. But it turns out that with better research and better tools that we have at our disposal, stress is the killer for your nerve endings in your ears as well. It's for your hearing. So a lot of what I do is we intervene with musicians, many of whom are very, very stressed, and we try to get them to exercise more. These are things that are good for their whole body, not just their ears, become less stressed. I'm from Canada, so we do have access to cannabinoids, which isn't prevalent, and it isn't all that it's turned out. Many people think it's the best thing since sliced bread. It's not, but in well-controlled, well-defined environments, usually under the care of a primary care physician, cannabinoids can be very, very useful at decreasing stress. Combine that with psychotherapy. So it's not just audiology 101 where we kind of reduce hearing levels. That is certainly a factor, though.
It's interesting. I talked to Professor Ben David at Reichman University in Israel, and he's done a lot of stuff where he talked about how love makes you hear better. So if you have a picture of a loved one while you're performing audiologic tasks, you actually hear better than if you don't, or if you have a blank person. So you're coming at it from a different direction, but it's the whole concept that the well-being of the mind and the body help with the well-being of the ear and the performance of communication and hearing that. And so is it also that because rock and roll has more bass and classical music typically has more higher tone sounds? Is that also why? Because I mean, not that bass is terrible, but the consonants are a little higher up in the spectrum. So it would seem if you're exposed to more high pitched sounds, you'd have more problems than if you were to low pitch sound by and large.
Well, it turns out that in well-defined laboratory experiments, that is the case. But in reality, the difference is so small that it really doesn't matter. I think the biggest difference between rock and roll and classical music is that rock and roll, they like to play it. They're enjoying it. They're happy with it. Classical music at a professional level is not a happy job.
There's technically challenging.
It's technically challenged. You may be forced to sit in front of trumpet players who don't like you personally. You may have to, if in these cases of long-running shows, play the same music night after night after night after night, and it's exhausting. You may have an artistic director that selects the music for you. It's not very nice in a classical environment. Whereas rock and rollers play the music they like. music. So
Right.
classical musicians tend to be much more stressed than rock and roller. And we get back to that stress response. And if you look at the research, it talks about all these technical terms and everything. But ultimately, in the last paragraph of many of these articles, it says, well, it's a stress response. So do everything you can to get enough sleep, to eat well, to exercise, to do the things, to fall in love, to do the things that reduce stress. There are some mechanical things that we could do. Since 1988, there's been a wonderful earplug out called the musician's earplug, also known as the ER15. ER stands for a company called Etymotic Research. And you can check it out by ETYMOTIC. It's a funny word, etymotic.com. And it'll take you to their website. They have a wealth of articles and publications there that you might really enjoy reading. But the big change in 1988 when they came out with the ER15 is that it lessens or attenuates all the sounds the same, whether it's the bass note on the left-hand side of the piano keyboard, the mid-range, or the right-hand treble notes on the right-hand side. And they bring them down equally such that music still sounds like music. It doesn't sound
to the
muffled.
foam plugs, which have a resonant frequency and rob some of the frequencies, correct?
Precisely. Very, very nicely said. So you still hear the full music as it was intended. So you can still play but the music will be slightly less damaging, hopefully at 85 decibels or lower, which still sounds very quiet, but you'll be able to play and enjoy your music. And the good side of that is that when I see you 25, 30 years from now, your hearing will still be very good.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just a personal story. My son sings in an a cappella group in college, and he has an Apple Watch, and the Apple Watch keeps on telling him that he's overexposed. And it's actually when the group's performing. And so he's actually now supplied with musician plugs for that exact reason, which you wouldn't think. I mean, there's no music. I mean, there's no background or instruments. It's all vocal. And even just with vocals, he's up around 105 to 110 dB.
Oh my goodness, that's impressive. Also impressive that he's musically inclined. I work hard at my music. My son calls me a music technician, but I do try. But there is an interesting formula, not to bore you with the formula, but nobody's going to listen to 85 decibels for 40 hours a week. We have a life. We're doing different things. But 85 decibels for 40 hours a week is identical to 88 decibels for only 20 hours a week. 91 decibels, 3 decibels up for only 20 hours a week. Where am I? 10 hours a week. 94 for 5 hours a week, 97 decibels for 2-ish, and 100 decibels for a little over an hour a week. So you can go to a rock concert on Friday night and enjoy yourself thoroughly at 100 decibels. Just don't mow your lawn the next day. Get someone else to do it for you.
But cumulative exposure matters.
Cumulative exposure matters. Well said.
Yeah. And so just one of the things I was curious about, is there a difference in people's ability to perceive loudness? In other words, if something if it's 1 decibel different, 2 decibel, you were saying we're not good at too loud. I think what I took away was that we're not good at sensing too loud versus not too loud, as compared to, is there a difference in, if we compare two sounds of the same different loudness, can the ear perceive that or no?
Yes. We can perceive, we have what's called a just noticeable difference. And at quieter levels, it's around 3 decibels. So I can say ah and ah, the second one being about 3 decibels louder. And you could maybe over the podcast detect, but at very, very high levels, it only takes about 1 decibel to perceive a difference. The ear is different. And also people with hearing loss, you think that they have poor hearing because they have a hearing loss. That's kind of in the name. But it turns out that they can discern smaller differences. They have something in their ear, a damage that we call recruitment, which just means that the ear can discern these smaller differences. And so if we were to fit them with hearing aids, for example, we want to make sure that the hearing aid does the opposite of the damage in their ears. We use something called a compressor or compression to reduce overly loud sounds while making soft sounds still louder for them. And we have to know this intimately. But this is true whether they listen to speech or for music. In that sense, there's not a big difference between the two.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting because I've always thought of recruitment as a challenge, but it might be more protective. And at what level do people actually feel pain from a sound? Is there a particular sound level that occurs?
That does vary from person to person, but again, we use the decibel scale. But by the way, I've used the word decibel several times during this podcast, but it's a unit of the physical vibration, the intensity in the air. The original name actually was called Bell, B-E-L, named after Alexander Graham Bell's father, Melville Bell. And somewhere along the line, they found out that the bell was too large. So they sliced it up 10 equal parts. And that's why you have the small d in front of the deci, meaning 1/10 of a bell. So that's the history behind that. So um, 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 I would say that right now, over the podcast, I'm speaking at about 65 decibels, a dial tone, or maybe if I spoke really, really loud in a party and there's background noise, I might be speaking in the 80 decibels. But anything over about 110 decibels, many people with normal hearing would find that to be very bothersome. So if you go on a tarmac of an airport and a plane takes off, even a normal propeller plane, you're going to far exceed that pain threshold of about 110, 115 decibels. It does vary from person to person. But long before the pain sets in, you're going to have the potential damage to your ear, long before that. In some sense, life would be so much easier in the hearing healthcare profession field if blood gushed out of our ears when we damaged the ears. Wouldn't that be nice? It would be so much, we'd have blood everywhere.
Calls would be a little bit different, but yes, I guess it would be from an alarm point of view.
But it would be so clear, but we sometimes call hearing loss the invisible handicap. It sneaks up so gradually over many, many years. There's not pain, there's not irritation, there's no blood gushing from the ears. It just happens so gradually over the years. So people have to become more aware of things, self-aware of things.
Yeah.
Moderation.
That's great. And so how about, people talk about the rule of thumb that if you can have a normal conversation 3 feet away with somebody, then the background noise is not too loud. Is that valid? Or
it is. That actually is a very reasonable sort of thing. If you can have a normal conversation and the background noise isn't so bad that you have to raise your voice, or if after a while you find yourself straining and you have a sore throat, maybe you don't even realize that you're talking a bit louder, that environment might be potentially damaging. And I say potentially because nothing wrong with listening to 100 decibels. Nothing wrong with listening to 110 decibels, which is near your pain threshold, as long as it's for a very short period of time and you don't accumulate it by mowing your lawn or up in the northern climes of the United States and Canada, snow blowing or doing other noisy things up here. So music exposure is not the only source of exposure of noise for a musician. Musicians love to listen to their music. They love to get on their motorcycle. I don't know if they love to mow their lawn, but they do mow their lawn and they do other sorts of noisy activities. And again, nothing wrong with the cumulative aspect of all the noise or all the music, as long as it doesn't exceed something. And you brought up a very interesting point, or we've been talking about it and dancing around it. Hearing loss from loud music or loud noise, for that matter, is like a dose. And the best analogy is an X-ray technician. When you injure your arm and they take an X-ray of it, the technician has a badge on it. And when this badge turns a certain color, they've hit the maximum weekly dose and they have to take a vacation from the X-ray that may be stray in that environment. Well, hearing loss is very much like that as well. We can have 100% of the dose, which is 85 decibels for 40 hours a week, or 100 decibels for only 1 or 2 hours a week. And that in both cases be 100%. And so we really don't care about the sound level per se, but the sound level and for how long we're exposed to it. When those things are together, that's when we have the dose. And there are many commercially available doses, and there are dose meters rather. And there's actually one on your cell phone you get for free on both Android and iOS, Apple. There's one out of Australia called Sound Log, and it gives you a dose and it says you've been exposed for 72% of your weekly dose or whatever, and it'll give you this thing. Another one is in the United States by NIOSH, NIOSH. If you go to their website, National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health.
Right.
As a Canadian, I have to think that through there.
Right.
And they have a wonderful sound level meter that has a dosimetry or a dose option to it. And it will also give you statements like you have been exposed for, or you can be exposed for 15 minutes in this environment without exceeding your maximum dose of noise or music exposure.
Yeah, and for consistency for the listeners, and that's why, for instance, gunfire is it's short, but because it's so loud, it causes damage. For instance, because it's a very short dose, but such a high dose, you get damage from that. For instance,
Exactly.
and so, in my experience, there seems to be a genetic predisposition to hearing damage from noise exposure. Do you see that, or?
There are people that are definitely more susceptible genetically. And we don't fully understand that. Even we have large international standards, models of hearing loss. There's a large one called ISO, International Standards Organization, 1999 standard, which is considered the best standard that we have today. It's based on thousands upon thousands of otherwise healthy workers. And there are some people that have more than predicted. Some people have less than predicted, but we do find that some people are more susceptible than others. But there's no indicator for that. So, for example, there's something called temporary threshold shift. If we go to a rock concert, if I was to measure your hearing just before the rock concert and then measure your hearing again immediately after the rock concert, there would be a temporary difference or reduction in your hearing. After 16 to 18 hours, the hearing would come back to normal or your pre-exposure level.
That's why the tinnitus sometimes goes away when you're away from the concert in a certain period of time.
Exactly. And we thought that would be a good indication. That is, if you had a lot of temporary hearing loss, down the line, 30 years later, you'd be more susceptible than someone that had almost no hearing loss. Turns out that's not the case. And so if somebody comes to your office or if after a rock concert, your ears are numb, they feel muffled, you get back in your car, you have to turn up the radio louder than when you left it. There's ringing in the ears, all these things together. These are indications of temporary threshold shift. I wrote the app for that. But that's not necessarily an indicator of future hearing loss down the line. All we can say is that if you don't have any temporary hearing loss in these environments, you also probably won't have any long-term hearing loss in these environments. But we can't say anything more than that. There's no other correlation between it.
Yeah, I was around a lot of people in the American military, and there were some people who would be around ordinances for 20 years and have no hearing loss. And there would be other people who just joined the military, they'd be around ordinance and they'd have a precipitous hearing loss. So that was kind of where I figured there was a genetic predisposition.
Yeah, there is, but other than saying, yes, it does happen, we don't understand it.
And so when people have an audiogram with a noise-induced hearing loss, it has a certain pattern typically. Right.
Yes, that is true. So an audiogram is just a hearing test, and that's what we do. We put the earphones on, put your hand up and push a button every time you hear a beep, and then we find the softest sound that you hear across a whole range of pitches or frequencies, from the middle of the piano keyboard to just above the top right-hand side of the piano keyboard. But usually what happens, the way we use it is we have a special decibel scale where a flat line, a horizontal flat line at the very top means it's normal. And then we have anything down from the top being a hearing loss. Usually as you get a little bit older, past the age of 40 or 50, I know that I'm 67, so I guess I'm up in that range. In the left-hand side, the bass notes is still very good, but you might have a hearing loss, a decrease in your hearing for the higher pitch consonant sounds. That's where the clarity comes from, and that's why I might say, oh, I hear you, but you're mumbling. It's not very clear. But it would just keep going south as you get a little bit older, as the frequency goes up. With loud noise or loud music, it falls down, and then around the top end of the piano keyboard, it turns around and gets better again. So if I was to test yourself a full 8 white notes above the top end of the piano keyboard, you're almost back to normal again, even though you may have had a very significant hearing loss an octave or 2 below that. And we have that little notching that occurs, not with all people, not with all musicians, but a significant number of them.
Why is it?
There are 4 reasons, but the biggest one is that greatest hearing loss always occurs 1/2 octave above the most intense level of the music. And there's a couple of technical and psychophysical reasons for this. But we happen to have an ear canal, and our ear canal is about 1 inch long. And that ear canal, unfortunately, has a resonant pitch at around 3,000 hertz. It's near the top end of the piano keyboard, that may be 4 or 5 white notes below the top end of the piano keyboard. So regardless of what comes in,
Your microphone move.
Oh, I moved my earphone. I moved my microphone. Not very technical. Sorry about that.
Okay.
But because we have a natural amplifier in our ear canal, normal hearing people, everyone does, that boosts up all the sound near the top end of the piano keyboard, that it exacerbates the sound such that at the inner ear, that sound maybe a little bit higher, or a half octave higher, around 4,000 hertz, the top end of the piano keyboard, maybe a little bit higher. That's the area of the worst hearing loss. It's really kind of neat the way that works out.
That is. I didn't know the reason why. I mean, I know clinically how to explain it. I just didn't know the reason why. That's great. You learn something new every day. That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about your book that's coming out. We talked about a little bit for the pre-interview, but you have a book coming out. What's it called?
I do. It's called Music and Hearing Aids, and it's going to be published by pluralpublishing.com. They're a large publisher in the hearing healthcare field. It won't be out until mid-March, but in some sense, it's a book that I didn't want to write because it means that I've failed preventing hearing loss. So I've recommended the hearing protection for whatever reason. Now I have this whole generation of hard of hearing people coming into my office because maybe they didn't follow my who knows why, but they have hearing loss.
A lot. I mean, let's be honest. Yeah. Usually I think it's lack of not lack of awareness, not discount of advice.
Yeah. Or just people that are not musicians, you and I, or just anyone else who just want to listen to music on occasion. So it's how do you set a hearing aid that has been optimized for music versus speech? And speech and music are very similar in many respects. They're vibrations in the air. They have low bass notes on the left-hand side. They have treble notes on the right side, but they have some differences that make it important for us to know the difference when fitting hearing aids with music. I don't want to be too technical and get too much into it, but I do suggest that you do contact your hearing healthcare specialist, such as an audiologist, for example, who can at least walk you through it if music is important, whether it's just listening to music or the playing of music is important to you in your everyday lives, don't give up. Don't stop playing music. There are now things that can be done.
And is the limitations, so one of the things that's could be confusing to the audience is the speaker in your ear is called the receiver because it receives the signal from the processor, but it's essentially the speaker. Is the limitation of that in terms of its frequency range that it can output, does that limit people's ability to get music as they would like?
That's a very good question. Well, hearing aids have really three components: the microphone, the amplifier, and the receiver, the loudspeaker that's in the ear. The microphone has been optimized and is still the same one we use since 1988, and that has no limitations. The receiver that's in the ear also has been optimized, and in the last 5 or 6 years, it has the greatest range of sounds or bandwidths that we need, and that's not the limitation. The limitation is actually because hearing aids are now digital. And in fact, in the olden days, in the 1980s, we actually were better able to help people with hearing loss to listen to music than we do now with the digital ones. Digital hearing aids have a technology called the analog to digital converter. That's next to the microphone, and it's what turns it into digits so that the digital hearing aid can work. The problem is the analog to digital converter had a limit, an upper limit, a ceiling. Think of it as a ceiling. Speech was here, which is fine, but even quiet music has peaks far in excess of this limit. And so we would slice off or distort the music even before it got to the hearing aid. Now, at least we have hearing aids where that limit has been pushed way, way up, almost to the limit of the microphone, such that music can get in more effectively now. And we talk about that a little bit in the book and ways of doing that. One way that we used to do it, I used to suggest to people, take some wraps of Scotch tape, wrap around your microphone, dumb down the sensitivity of the microphone so the output would also be reduced and it'd be more in a usable range.
Well, you wouldn't have any clipping, right? That was the point, right? You wouldn't clip off the tones. Interesting, because I mean, there's a very small population. It is a waning population of, people will say they're power junkies, but people who want to remain in the analog amplification because they like the quality of the sound.
Now, the old analog hearing aids used to distort themselves, but in a different way. And
Right.
we can actually simulate that distortion with modern hearing aids, and they say, "Oh, that sounds like it was the olden days." Also, clinically, to be fair, somebody would come in and say, "Well, I heard so much better in the 1980s." Well, your hearing was maybe
Right.
much, much better
Well, yeah.
45 years
Your
ago.
ears were healthier 45 years ago,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So that's a limitation. A little strategy that you might want to use when listening to music, if you're in your car or at home, turn down the volume of the radio, or whether it's in your car at home, and if necessary, turn up the volume of the hearing aid, not the other way around. So
Right.
reduce the volume coming in, so you don't clip it, and then amplify it on going out.
So, right. So it's clipping the signal coming in, not clipping the signal going out, is what you're telling me.
Precisely, exactly.
Oh, okay. That's great. And that's worth it on and of itself. So that's a great tip. So, one of the questions I love asking people is, who would you thank? Who are your mentors or the people that you would thank for helping you get to where you are today?
Well, I'd have to suggest a gentleman in Chicago named Mead Killian. Isn't that a great name? Mead
Yes.
Killian is the founder of Etymologic Research, and I alluded to them before. But Mead, especially in 1988, he had one of these miracle years, the Annus Mirabilis years. In 1988, he invented the insert earphone that can go in the ears, and we use that ubiquitously for testing hearing now. He also invented the ER15 musician earplugs, and he also invented a analog hearing aid called the K-amp, which was perfect for music back then. And we're just now playing catch up to the analog hearing aid idea of the K-amp. I think we're there now. Just in the last year or two, do I think we're there now. But if it wasn't for Mead Killian, who also, by the way, was involved in the miniaturization of the microphones we use in hearing aids and the loudspeaker, that one man,
Did a lot.
he did a lot. And without his innovation, we would still be here spinning our wheels. So I have to accredit Mead Killian.
That's great. That's a great piece of history. Is he still alive?
He wrote the foreword to my book. He is still very much alive. His retirement means that he only works 60 hours a week. That's his
good for
retirement.
him. Yeah. Well,
Yes.
retirement maybe is when you go to work when you want to, not because you have to. So that's excellent. So, and then the other question I love to ask people is, what is your favorite sound?
Oh, definitely kids laughing.
That's great. And you're around that, I assume, hopefully.
All the time. I teach karate to small kids. I get to beat up kids. Like who's that guy on Seinfeld? Forget his name. There was a character that was so impressed. Kramer, thank you. I don't beat. If anything, they beat me up. But I like working with kids.
No, that's fun. So, Dr. Chasin, if people wanted to get a hold of you, how would they get a hold of you if they wanted to contact?
Through my website, info@musiciansclinics.com. So again, it's plural of musicians, plural of clinics, info@musiciansclinics.com.
So, folks, we've had Dr. Marshall Chasin. He's an audiologist and the Director of Audiology Research at Musicians Clinics Canada. He just told you how to get a hold of him. This has been a great episode. I think this is awesome information for our audience, and I really appreciate you giving us the time to explain these things, and I appreciate your work in this field that you're clearly passionate about.
It's been a great pleasure, Dr. Sims. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listen Up podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.